So Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to this informal interview. We've already had a very interesting chat about your background. If you could just tell me a little bit again about the background you've had and how that's kind of developed into this real research interest in criminology and justice in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo in particular.
Yeah. So basically, as I said, based on my PhD, where I looked at the demography of armed conflict, so basically looking at the consequences of armed conflict on the demography of a specific country. And I looked at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it's now called a post-conflict country, but they've had a long conflict dated from, say, the 1998 all the way up to 2004, where they had a peace agreement, and then they had a referendum in 2005, when they've agreed the new constitution and had the first elections in 2006, almost 40 years since the latest democratic elections. So it was quite promising. Then from that point, I was now interested more to look into population and criminal justice dynamics within post-conflict countries, and especially in this case looking at the criminal justice and population dynamics in the Democratic Republic of Congo, mainly because everyone would expect there to be some kind of chaos after an armed conflict, a very violent armed conflict. So it's very important in my sense to start to research areas related to population, how population is changing. Do we have more birth now than we had before the conflict? Do we have less? Mortality has gone down or up after the conflict? And also looking at things like prison population, because everyone would expect now, trying to rebuild the country, there may be possibly more prisoners, or there will be more, the rule of law will be more implemented. So these are the kind of things I'm really interested in, and I've already started to look at mapping the prison population in Congo. So by mapping, I'm just thinking about looking at how many prisoners there are in Congo by province, and also looking at who are these prisoners in terms of their background, so the quantity and the quality of the prisoners, because the literature tend to say that in poor countries you tend to find more people that are in prison are also poor. So this is something I'm really interested in, to look into the prison population in the Congo. Despite the conflict, what type of prisoners or what type of people do we have in prisons? Are they educated? Are they poor? Are they rich? And so on. So these kind of dynamics I'm really interested in.
And so how do you go about it? What sort of data exists? You mentioned the focus on the demographics and the potential for using GIS, but do you focus on particular parts of the country, and to what extent do you get good quality data? How do you go about the study?
That's a very good question, because we've got to admit this, or confess from the start that there is not a big culture of data culture in the Democratic Republic of Congo. An example of that would be, for example, the census. The latest census in the Democratic Republic of Congo dated from 1984. So there've never been any other census since. So what I had to do, for example, with my previous research was to do population projection. So a method used in statistics or demography, where we do it's called cohort component projection. So we're projecting population, but factoring on the three main components of population change, which is fertility, mortality, and migration. So we are trying to make a projection from the latest census to, say, the period covered by the research, say 2004. So we're projecting that population, taking into account the fact that fertility will change, mortality will change, and migration will change. So we are factoring this into a projection model. So the way to do this is to have benchmarks at key points, and the benchmark is the data and some of the rates coming from more recent surveys. These surveys are not the actual census, but they help us to correct, for example, fertility rate, they help us to correct mortality rate and migration rate. So we benchmark using two scenarios. One scenario is when we assume the conflict did not exist, so population was progressing in the same way it was in 1984 at the latest census. And the second scenario would be the counterfactual, where we are correcting this projection using the benchmark. As I said, if there's been a survey, say for example the DHS, this is the Demographic and Health Survey funded by the UNICEF, which is quite regular. I think every 4 years they kind of survey the country, then they'll give you new fertility rate, new mortality rate. It's based on female populations, mothers giving birth, but there is a way to extrapolate this to obtain male mortality rates, as kind of to derive some of the other rates that we need to help our projection going forward.
Thank you. And is this done as a sort of at the national level, or can you break it down to provinces and get more kind of local projections as well?
Absolutely. So these are national, but as you say, it's absolutely possible to break this down to subnational levels as well, because as long as you can have the rates at subnational level, you can benchmark your projections at national or subnational level, depends on the area you are focusing on.
So just to sort of project a bit into the future in terms of your own aspirations for this research and what impact you'd like it to have, how would you like to see it develop in the future? Does it have particular policy implications and messages? And if you could just say a little bit about the sort of gender lens as well, and how that features in this work.
Absolutely. So looking at the future, I think it is very important that we research these areas, because this will help inform policy, especially when we say looking at criminal justice dynamics. So this research may help inform policy, criminal justice policy in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with an end goal, for example, of having a global database on prison population, where we would know exactly how many prisoners we have, every single prisoner, how long they're in prison for, and helping the authorities to manage prison population in a much more systematic and accurate way. For example, when time for release arrives, these people can be freed and they can go back into the community and so on. If you don't have the data, you don't know how many prisoners you have, how long they're in prison for, is very difficult to manage. So this kind of project can help actually being able to grasp the numbers and the quality of the prisoners that you have. This is just one example going forward. So if we can have an impact in informing policy in that area, that will be really beneficial.
And just going back to the gender aspect, is there anything you want to add on that?
Absolutely. Again, sorry, I kind of missed that part of your question. Gender is very important. I know reading, I don't know if you've come across some of the literature, some of them calling the Democratic Republic of the Congo as the world capital of rape. So gender-based violence is quite a big thing in the Democratic of Congo, and recently they've been collecting some data on gender-based violence. Some people are trying to link this to the armed conflict, but the issue is probably more widespread than the actual armed conflict, because one of the latest DHS data, Demographic and Health Survey, actually show that even areas that were not that much affected by the conflict actually had high rates of gender-based violence. So this can be something that is almost becoming cultural. So again, it's a case of now trying to target and find out exactly what are the drivers, why is this happening, and also being able to, because I'm pretty sure that with good data, good research, we will be able to target, to identify what are the factors and target some of the intervention to see if that can be corrected.
And earlier in our conversation, you were kind of telling me about some of the early research you did in this country, in the UK, in Southampton, which sounded very fascinating, particularly looking at the victims and the demographics around violent crime. And I guess one could also look at the perpetrators, but would some of that research as well be possible to do in Democratic Republic of Congo? Would the data for that be possible to obtain, so you can kind of look at the policies and policy needs around that? And is that an area of interest?
Yes, absolutely, and that's a very good question, because what I'm thinking is that it's possible to borrow some of the techniques and the methods used here, because as I said, the culture of data management is not really developed in some of the countries we're interested in. So having a country like the UK where the culture of data is really advanced can help us actually frame some kind of index of, for example, access to justice, or index of likelihood of becoming a victim of any type of crime. And framing that in that way, we will be able to borrow some of the techniques and frame an index of access to justice, say in some of the high mortality or post-conflict countries, and see how far we are from what we can agree with other colleagues or other researchers in this field to be kind of the minimum that we need for access to, in terms of access to justice, or in terms of fighting and gender-based violence. So you can have some index and then implementing them into these countries and see how far we are, what is the way to go, how far we need to go to cover at least the minimum.
What I'm picking up from this discussion is interesting, the importance of some quantitative techniques and approaches. Do you also, in some of the sort of social considerations, draw on qualitative methods in your research?
Yeah, I think that I'm sorry I have to laugh about this, because I was just reading some of the feedback from my student here, master's student, because I'm one of the unit coordinators for research method and research ethics. And in most of my lectures and the examples, they had to tell me that I sound a bit biased, because I tend to lead them towards quantitative research. You can understand why I am biased, because I come from that kind of background. But absolutely, I think qualitative research is very much needed, because everything we are going to do quantitatively, that needs to be underpinned by kind of qualitative research. So yes, and in my way of doing things, I'm hoping that everything I will do, if it is quantitative, there should be an equivalent of a qualitative input to that.
Well, thank you very much. I know you said at the start to me that you're also from the DRC, so I'm sure there's a personal motivation underlying this research, and I wish you all the very best with it in the future.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you.